Hello everyone, welcome to this Investment Climate Reform Facility webinar on promoting equal opportunities for women in the labour market through business environmental reforms. My name is Karl Belizaire. I'm here from the British Council representing the ICR facility today, and the facility which supports public and private stakeholders across Africa, the Caribbean, and Pacific countries to improve their investment climate and business environment via public and private dialogue. We have a great panel today to discuss the topic at hand, promoting equal opportunities for women in the labour market through business environmental reforms. But before we get into, we'll also be taking some questions from a panel of speakers as well. So throughout the event, if you have any questions you'd like to pose to any of the speakers or the panelists, please do drop them into the chat and we'll do our best to respond to them later. Please do mute your microphones as the session is recorded. And as you mentioned, if you have any questions, do drop it into the chat. But before we start with our speakers and the welcoming address, we're going to just play a short video, a short introductory video to explain a little bit more about the ICR facility. Fantastic. So there's a bit of an introduction for those who aren't familiar with the Investment Climate Reform Facility, the objective of which is to support countries and the regional institutions across Africa, the Caribbean and the Pacific in the public-private dialogue process to create a more conducive and sustainable investment climate. And you'll see on the screen there on the slide, there's a few different strands of how we're doing and approaching that, including technical assistance, strengthening national and sub-regional DFIs in countries with tailor-build capacity building, as well as sharing and compiling knowledge and information through events like this. So that's why we're here today. So again, thank you for tuning in. I'm going to, in a moment, invite some of our speakers for a welcome introduction. But just to highlight, today's event is actually part of a series of business environmental reform for women's economic empowerment series. And this is the second event of 3. So we previously explored more about, with regards to an entrepreneurship perspective. Today very much we'll be exploring empowerment and employment. And there's a future and a further dialogue to come in November, which you can look out for as well. So to center back in for today, we're going to have some opening remarks, a short presentation from the author of the latest ICR report on promoting equal opportunities for women in the labour market through business environment reforms. Then we're going to invite international guests and panelists to share their views, experiences and perspectives on the topic at hand today. So first of all, we're going to invite a welcome address from Escipión, Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of African, Caribbean, Pacific States, just to say a few words for a welcome address. So I'll just hand over to my first speaker. Give us a brief welcome. Okay, I believe that we're still having a little technical difficulty. Perhaps we'll start instead with one of our lead supporting colleagues, a policy officer of the European Commission. Miguel, are you with us today? Miguel Campo-Llopis. Perhaps we can invite you to say a few welcoming words.
Yes, now I think I'm unmuted now. Can you hear me, Karl?
Loud and clear. Over to you.
Because I couldn't unmute myself. Sorry for that. Yeah, so thank you, Karl. I'll be brief, just to say some opening remarks and to welcome everyone to this webinar. We're very, very happy to see that we are making progress with some of the issues that we've been discussing within the ICR facility, and especially on the women economic empowerment front. I think this is a key issue for the European Commission, who's one of the supporters of the ICR facility, together with the OACPS, the German government and the British government. And we are extremely happy to be in this webinar today. Women economic empowerment, as I said, is at the center of our agenda, but specifically access to labor market is a key element if we want to really ensure full participation of women in the economic and social life of any country. We know for a fact that women supporting women economic empowerment it's makes sense from a moral and ethical point of view, but it also makes a lot of sense from an economic point of view. And somehow we are losing the opportunity as countries to fully develop our economic capacity and our economic knowledge by not including making sure that women can fully participate in these processes. Therefore, having this type of discussions, this type of webinars are vital. This is only one of many actions that we are supporting through the ICR facility, and we expect to support even more in the near future. For us, it's key that we make sure that we open this conversation on how to strengthen women organizations, how to better support what type of policy and regulatory reforms we need to tackle to actually make sure that there's equal access to the labor market, and not only equal access to labor market, but even more to make sure that women can actually access new segments of the economy that are more productive for the overall country, but also where they are traditionally have been excluded. This is a complex issue because there are a number of layers that don't allow women to fully participate. But of course, we are fully committed with this. Most of the ACP countries are also fully committed, and we're just trying to support their overall efforts to try to move forward in this direction. I won't extend much more, just to say that the ICR facility, as Karl was saying, provides support for business environment reform and investment climate, but we really would like to see more requests coming from the countries, from the public and private organizations linked to this aspect of women economic empowerment. So I would like today to invite all participants to really think how can we support them in moving forward in this direction. And I think the team would be more than enthusiastic to fully support any request that comes from us, from you, and from the European Commission and the OACPS, also fully supportive of any way we can fully support you and work with you. So I'll stop here, give you back the floor, Karl, and hope you have a great webinar and interesting discussion. Thank you.
Miguel, thank you so much for dialing in and for joining us. It's greatly appreciated, a very warm and kind welcome and call to action. So I believe we have a bit of an apology from one of our other initial Escipión from the OACPS, and unfortunately unable to join us today. However, we'll keep the show rolling without further ado and introduce our next and significant contributor, Dr. Susana Martinez-Restrepo, who's the Senior International Expert for Gender and Development. He's very kindly joining us today, and we're sharing a bit of a presentation and summary of some of the research and reports that you've written of late. So hi, Susana.
Hi, Karl. Thank you for the invitation. I'm really happy to share the study that we wrote together, team effort, and that would shed the light also for some of the comments and the debates that we're going to have today in this webinar.
Wonderful. Over to you.
Okay. So I'm gonna try to be really good with time management to give time to everybody to comment. So this is the second of the series that we have been writing. This is about business environment reforms to promote equal empowerment, equal opportunities for women in the labor market. The first one was about women, how to promote women entrepreneurs, and this one then is about equal opportunities in the labor market. And as Miguel was saying, this is key because we want to create jobs. We also want to increase earnings. We also want to improve the quality of work, and we also want to create job opportunities in areas that are expanding. The World Economic Forum, for example, says that the automation and also activities that have been strengthening with the pandemic are increasing jobs in traditionally male-dominated sectors, and we have seen a destruction in areas, sectors, activities of traditionally female-dominated sectors. So we want to understand how laws, regulations, and fiscal reforms can promote that, but we know that this is not everything. This is the beginning of the process. We also have to tackle gender norms, cultural norms, and other many constraints that we face in order to promote gender equality and women's economic empowerment. Next. So what is the situation? We see, for example, here in orange, women, in gray, men, and then the gap, we see that the gap between labor market participation by gender is really important. It is greater in some areas, like in sub-Saharan Africa. It is lower in the Pacific Islands, but we see a gap in every region. And the important thing is that these are statistics that we have access. It depends how countries measure these inequalities, but when we see the gaps in terms of earnings, of paid work, of the quality of work between women and men, these gaps are even greater. Next. So how do we explain these gaps? We have legal barriers. They're implicit or explicit. And implicit is that somehow, if the rules are written in a certain way, they can affect women, and not because it says women cannot work, but because of the way they are written, maybe because they can affect more women head of household. We're going to see a little bit more of that. Or it can be explicit. It can be really that the rules and regulations said women cannot go out at night and work, which limits certain kind of jobs that women can do. So there are legal barriers, implicit or explicit. There are regulations that limit the sectors where women can work. For example, if women cannot work at night, if women cannot take public transportation, if women cannot issue a passport with the permission of the husband, that can limit a lot the opportunities they have. Of course, social and cultural norms that are in everything, everywhere, and in every continent, not only among ACP countries. Very important, perhaps one of the most important, the time dedicated to domestic chores and care activities limit the time women have for paid jobs, and also the quality of the jobs they can address. So this is also very important, but this normally is not addressed in laws or regulations. Lack of affordable care, lack of access, cost, and distances of transportation that limit women's mobility. Of course, low education attainment among women limit women's employment opportunities. This is true, and we talk a lot in the report in sub-Saharan Africa and Pacific Islands, but it's not true in the Caribbean. It's actually the opposite. Caribbean women have greater education attainment, particularly in the higher, like in bachelor's and master's degree, than men. So that's good news, and we need to understand how to promote more education among men. And very important, as I was saying, COVID worsened these trends. Women are even more time poor. There's destruction of jobs in traditional female-dominated sectors like restaurants and certain face-to-face services, and this is worsening the gaps that we already knew. Next. So this is an example of how bad is the situation with the daily hours spent in unpaid domestic and care work that limit women's opportunities to have a paid job or income or remunerated activities. So for example, if we see the case of Tanzania, well, women spend on average 3.9 hours on domestic and care work, meaning taking care of children and the elder and people with disabilities. Men only spend 1. So this difference affects the likelihood women would have greater opportunities in the labor market. Next. But as I was saying, is not the only issue. So why is it important to address labor market gaps? So as an economist, I like to focus in the numbers. And of course, there's many arguments that focus on the morality and the need to address these. Here we have some economic arguments as well. And the total GDP loss due to gender inequality per year in earnings was calculated in 11.4% in sub-Saharan Africa, 16.6% in East Asia and the Pacific. We put them together because we didn't have data only for Pacific Islands, and 7.9% in Latin America and the Caribbean. Same case, we didn't have disaggregated data for both. Discriminatory laws and social norms and practices are the cause of an 8% loss in global investment, and 12% decrease in labor force participation of women, which resulted in 7.5% loss in the global GDP. So another very important number, how if we address these inequalities and we promote women's employment and also women entrepreneurs, we can increase country GDP and the global GDP. Individual tax filing could increase women's labor force participation by 15.5%. And we're going to see a lot of details on how fiscal systems can disincentive women to enter particularly formal jobs. And also, very important, improving women's labor market participation and the quality of their work has positive effects for them, their families, the society overall. We also know, we discussed how it can reduce the likelihood of getting or not being able to live an abusive relationship, so reducing gender-based violence, the intergenerational transmission of poverty. So there's many, many, many advantages, not only, of course, economic, but many advantages that we suggest. Next. So how do we do this? Increasing women's labor participation through legal reforms. Next. So we have these really, really interesting tables, which are based on Women, Business, and the Law by the World Bank. And this is a study I really recommend. Every year they update the data. And basically here we have some of the laws that could affect women's employment in ACP countries. So for example, there are countries with laws restricting women from beginning a job in the same way as a man. Maybe there are more paperwork. Sometimes they need the permission of the husband. We have examples of countries like Cameroon, Chad, Comoros, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, Guinea-Bissau, Mauritania, that restrict women's ability to get a job in the same way as a man. And other countries, for example, where the law does not prohibit discrimination in employment based on gender. This doesn't mean that they are not prohibiting women to work in the same way as a man, but they are not condemning companies that do discriminate against women. So that regulation is really important, because if a woman feels discriminated, then she can take action towards these companies, and then there's a law that protect them. So there are many, many countries, and this is true globally, that do not have any law that prohibit discrimination. So they don't have the tools to go against that. One example, Barbados doesn't have, Botswana, Brunei Darussalam, Jamaica, Micronesia. So one of the ways we can promote is create these laws that prohibit discrimination. Of course, that's a first step, because there's many more issues that we need to do. Next. Okay, so let's look at some examples. I really like this example of Ethiopia because it's really complete and because it has an impact evaluation. In 2000, Ethiopia reformed its family law, extending married women's access to marital property, removing restrictions that did not allow to work outside their homes. This is also a case study that we have in the first brief, because a lot of the restriction of the family law limit also women's likelihood to open and run a business, but also their employment, because they couldn't work outside their home without the permission of their husbands. So what happened? This shows what happens, how powerful it is, a law reform. Women, after the law was reformed, and this was evaluated with a randomly assigned experiment, because the law was implemented in different stages nationally, so it could be evaluated with very fancy techniques. And it found that women were more likely to be employed in jobs that could only be performed outside their homes, because now they didn't need the permission of their husbands. More women access skilled and full-time jobs that could only be performed outside their homes. More women access skilled and full-time jobs, and the policy had more benefits on younger and single women, also because they increased the age of marriage to 18. So they found that this was particularly strong for women, and this is also related to changes in social norms that would benefit more the younger population. Next. We found other examples without impact evaluation, meaning what happened after the law was implemented, but we found that, for example, Marshall Islands, Senegal, Sierra Leone, and Ethiopia developed strategies to change laws and regulations that impede women's equal labor market opportunities. In the Marshall Islands, for example, they prohibited gender-based discrimination in the workplace, and the law began to mandate equal pay for equal work, which is the other law that I was discussing in the table, that still many countries don't have that type of regulation. And very important, Sierra Leone adopted legislation on sexual harassment in the workplace. We have evidence that one of the main barriers for women to stay in certain jobs and be promoted is sexual harassment. They just decide to leave, and particularly this is really bad if the companies don't have any rules and regulations within the company, or if nationally there's not laws that prohibit sexual harassment in the workplace. Next. So some of the conclusions, it is essential to consider that even when countries adopt such reforms, social norms and customary laws can continue to affect women labor market opportunities. And we have some examples. Customary law refers more to the practices. So, and some ethnic groups, minorities in some countries might have their own set of customary laws. So we have examples when even if we reform the laws and regulations, customary law can go against that, and how we can address that. Promoting business environment reforms to allow more women-owned businesses to formalize creates employment opportunities for women. So also this is a little bit regarding the first report that we did, but we know that women create jobs for women. So, so by supporting women entrepreneurs, we're also creating more opportunities for women. ACP countries willing to increase labor market participation, earnings, and the quality of job need to identify and tackle these legal barriers that can affect women's economic empowerment opportunities. Next. So this is really important in times of COVID. We wanted to see what could we do to promoting women's participation in traditional male-dominated sectors and industries, particularly because we have evidence that the labor market is moving towards certain activities that are more concentrated in men. We also know that male-dominated sectors have greater income, greater earnings. So the World Bank has a study that explains that part of the gender pay gap is explained not only by discrimination and many issues that we already know of, but also because women tend to be in areas in industries that pay less. Some service areas, restaurants, and beauty salons, for example, in the care economy, and men tend to be in construction, manufacturing, and other industries that tend to pay less. In addition, we are seeing a creation and a destruction of jobs that are affecting women, and this process has been accelerating because of COVID. Next. So this is, again, we use the data from the World Bank, Women, Business, and the Law, and we found that, that there are many countries that have rules and regulations that do not allow women to access this type of jobs. So as an economist, I have heard so much when they say, oh no, but women don't want to work in construction because they just don't like it. It's at night, there's machines, they just don't like it. And we think that is a preference, but we also, and it might be partially explained by preferences, which also respond to social norms, but we also see that there are rules and regulations that just impede them to do those type of jobs, even if they want it. So the OECD suggests that there's 88 countries worldwide that prohibit women from entering certain occupations, and we have here some examples. So countries where women cannot work at night in the same way as men. So for example, there's Solomon Islands have that restriction, Somalia, Sudan, Vanuatu. Then we have countries where women cannot work in a job deemed dangerous. Then we have to see in the legislation what is deemed dangerous. In the same way as men, we have Mauritania, Mozambique, Niger, Papua New Guinea, Senegal, Sudan. And then countries where women cannot get an industrial job in the same way as men. Mauritania, Mozambique, Niger, Nigeria, so on and so forth. So we cannot say that women are not accessing these jobs that are growing, these sectors, these industries that are growing because they don't want to. There are also barriers in the legislation that we need to change in order to move more women. I was recently on holidays and I was really happy to see that in every construction on the road, half of the people were women driving trucks and leading the traffic. So those are some of the, but those jobs, they have to be done at night. In Somalia and in Sudan, in Vanuatu, women are not be able to do it. So that's an important change that we need to do in order to create jobs in these industries that pay more and that are growing. Next. Business environment reforms need to can consider these good practices that we find, although sometimes, as I was saying, we don't find impact evaluation, so we didn't know exactly what happened after the implementation of the law. But we have, for example, in 2018, the Democratic Republic of Congo lifted the ban on women working in industrial businesses. This was the case in Dar es Salaam in 2011 and Kiribati in 2016. In 2020, São Tomé and Príncipe lifted restriction on women's ability to work at night in mining and in jobs deemed dangerous. I'm actually currently working on a really, really cool project to increase women in the mining sector. And this is one of the first changes we need to do to include women in these areas. In some places, they don't even have the safety requirements to include women. Mining companies in Ghana have a skill development program for females that are linked to women in mining initiatives at the corporate level. So sometimes these initiatives to promote women in traditional male-dominated sectors can be also led by business associations and by large corporations when they really want to do these changes. Next. Another really, really interesting initiative to promote women in these areas is have public procurement point system to promote job creation for women. This means creating quotas for women through public procurement. In some countries, public procurement, meaning what the government hires for its services and goods, can represent 30% of the GDP in certain countries. We didn't find an example in ACP countries, but this is a really interesting example in Bogota, Colombia, that mandates that all contracts awarded by the city must include a quota to increase female participation in traditional male sectors. And they're not going to say, oh, we need 50-50 in construction, because there's simply not 50% of women with the skills required in construction, but they plan it over time so that now is 6.8% and next year is 10% and then is 15%, and also provide skill development so that there are more women that get trained to fulfill those jobs. So we thought that that was a really, really interesting example, though it's not ACP countries. Next. Third and last, really, really important, discriminatory fiscal systems and the role of tax incentives to promote more inclusive job markets for women are key. This is a very understudied subject. It has been studied mostly for industrialized economies, and we based a lot of our arguments on a book, which is not super recent, but this also shows the need to understand more and have country studies about how it affects women, particularly now as we work to formalize more women and more men in our economies. Next. So individual tax filing could increase women's labor force participation by 15.5%, from a current base of 17.9% for female with a high school diploma. This was a study based done by the IMF with Senegal. They did some projections and they found that just changing the way we tax families and women could increase this much, and it would have a greater effect on female, for example, you see there with a high school diploma, and it would reduce the gender gap by 15%. We have some examples of sub-Saharan African countries that did this reform. For example, Ghana in Ghana in 2010, single-parent household could not claim relief for financially dependent people, and this severely penalized women who had the majority of single-parent households. By 2014, this regulation was modified, and now every person with a dependent spouse or two and dependent children can apply for a marriage responsibility tax relief. So this is what I was suggesting at the beginning, that there's some implicit bias and explicit bias. So sometimes it's not that women cannot, if you're a woman, then you cannot claim the taxes. It's more like if you're a single parent household, and women are more likely to be on single parent households, they cannot claim tax relief. So they are affected because they're more likely to be single parent households. So this reform in Ghana in 2014 really helped increase income among women. And if they see that, because if there's too many problems for women to if they're going to be penalized with their income because they are single parent household and women, they can be less likely to have less incentives to join the labor market, the formal labor market. Next. So we can also create tax incentives to promote gender inclusive jobs. There are many examples that we cite in the report, and tax incentives can incentivize women to re-enter the workforce. The Malaysian government introduced a tax incentive program to encourage employers to train women who re-enter the labor force after taking a career break, for example, due to motherhood. And this can be done through, for example, deduction for companies that comply to this type of incentives. Next. So conclusions and policy recommendations that we came in this report include 3 main points that we should, if we leave this webinar with these 3 points on mind, I will be super happy. Next. 1, we need to promote legal reforms, equal opportunity start with equal treatment under the law. Legal frameworks must be reformed so that women can get jobs in the same way as men, and must penalize discrimination against women during recruitment process in the workplace. So we must promote legal reforms. It is important. It is not everything, as I was saying. There's many more issues to tackle, but it is a start. 2, we should create public procurement practices, incentives, creating, for example, a point-based system of quotas through government contracting can create new opportunities for women to access the labor market, particularly in traditionally male-dominated sectors. These initiatives can be implemented with training, complemented with training in areas traditionally dominated by male, like transportation, construction, and technology. 3, we should promote fiscal reforms, really important. Due to explicit and implicit bias, tax systems can penalize women's earnings and also discourage them to enter the formal labor force. Joint, something that I didn't discuss too much because I am over time, but joint tax system where men and women report together can disincentivize women to access the labor market because they're taxed more strongly. We need to understand more how these things work in Sub-Saharan Africa, in the Pacific Islands, in the Caribbean, because it's really understudied. And in addition to reforming tax systems, it is necessary to simplifying tax filings, because sometimes we move something like, okay, let's create all these taxes and let's reform it, but it is so complicated that it also creates disincentives. And we know that and very difficult administrative procedures tend to affect more women than men. So these are the 3 main conclusions. I invite you to read the report. It is really interesting, really practical, and we hope that you'll have ideas on ways you can promote women's employment in your countries through business reforms.
Wonderful, Susana. Thank you so much for sharing these insights and summary with us, but also for the effort of making the analysis, making it accessible as well. The report's been shared, the link's been shared in the chat for those tuned in. You can read the full report in your own time, but it'd also be good to get, we've had a couple of questions come in, but it'd be great if anybody has any questions for Susana or any of our speakers we're about to introduce, then please do drop them in the chat, and we'll do our best to come to them in a short moment. But yes, moving on, we would like to introduce some comments and reactions from our panel of speakers today, to which we have Richard, a Senior Research Fellow and Advisor for the Policy Research and Strategic Partnership at the Centre for Basic Research. We've got Sally with us from the Head of Corporate Communications and Marketing at the Kenya Association of Manufacturers and the Lead Coordinator for Women in Manufacturing Programme. We also have Virginia, who's a Global Coordinator for Women's Entrepreneurship Development from the International Labour Organization. So if you wouldn't mind putting your cameras on, we'll welcome our panel of speakers. Thanks for joining us. Wonderful. And I suppose, thanks again. Firstly, welcome. Hi. Thanks for joining us. And I'm going to come to each of you in turn, perhaps initially with Virginia, then Richard, and then Sally, just to get your kind of comments and reactions, really, reflections on the topic of the day, promoting opportunities for women in the labour market. Virginia, if we perhaps come to yourself first from the International Labour Organization, but also interested to hear your experiences in the Caribbean as well. So Virginia, perhaps firstly over to you.
Thank you so much, Karl, and good afternoon or good evening, good morning to those connecting. And I really want to start by thanking the Investment Climate Reform for inviting me to give my thoughts on behalf of the ILO Caribbean office, where I was actually stationed until the end of last year. Currently, I'm the Women's Entrepreneurship Development Global Coordinator, so this topic kind of falls right in where I was and where I am. I also want to congratulate Susana and the team for this paper, because I think it's really not an easy topic, and moreover, when you're covering such a diverse region as the ACP, and where the information or the data is also sometimes quite scarce, right? So with that having been said, I think I'll structure my 5 comments based on things that triggered me while I was reading the report, but also in terms of work that the ILO Caribbean office has been doing in the last few years, looking at gender and the labor market in Antigua and Barbuda, Dominica, Guyana, Jamaica, St. Lucia, and also some work we've been doing in terms of understanding women in business and management in the Caribbean, and women's entrepreneurship. And for that, we did surveys with over 650 companies in 13 countries in the Caribbean. And so based on that, I would want to kind of comment on a few things. You know, the ICR paper highlights legal reforms to greater inclusion of women in the labor market. It identifies initiatives to promote women in more male-dominated industries, which I think is a fascinating topic. It advocates for tax reforms, including individual tax filings, et cetera. As they set the scene, and Susana alluded to this, we see that the Caribbean in some aspects differs, right, from the other regions, especially, for example, in terms of education levels. In terms of employment, and in terms of what has been shown in those really interesting tables that Susana was sharing based on women, business, and the law, our research really does find also that in the constitutions of the countries that I mentioned before, they do prohibit sex discrimination, but most do not explicitly mention discrimination in the world of work. So it's that thing that Susana was talking about, implicit and explicit, right? And so, for example, we see that labor legislation addresses sex discrimination at work to varying degrees. It contains provisions to assure equal pay, for example, but it lacks that operational definition of how to ensure equal pay for work of equal value. So here, again, we see in the Caribbean how there are policies. It is afterwards how they're being implemented, where there are these loopholes or these gaps that we're seeing are actually impacting how women are entering or not and participating in the labor force. So I think, therefore, and I completely agree with the report and Susana about, you know, needing to work with these countries in making legal reforms, but also in how ensuring them and helping them implement those points. My second point, and I was really happy and even at the same time sad, that very early on in this report, we talk about, you know, the business environment reforms, but that we have to, for women's economic empowerment, these have to go alongside other measures. And I'm almost trying to advocate lately that we should actually not see business environment reform on the one side and then the other measures. If we're talking about women's economic empowerment, and even for anyone, there's certain things that always just should come together. And in that sense, you know, a reform process that aims to unlock the economic potential of women needs to go beyond that traditional business environment policy. We need to start looking at, and as Susana was saying in her presentation, family law, that it can impact how women's assets and ownership play, the social policies about care, and we'll come back to that, or I'll come back to that in a little bit. And then, as also it was mentioned, you know, those customary practices or there's informal rules. And in the Caribbean, you know, a major hindrance to equality in the world of work is exactly that adherence to norms, maintaining to a very traditional division of labor, where in the end women are considered, and they consider themselves responsible for most of the unpaid care work. So it's interesting to see that Caribbean governments have actually acted to establish rights to maternity leave and to pay as a way of facilitating mothers in retaining employment. Having that been said, for example, it's interesting to see that looking at the ILO conventions, so only Bahamas, to my knowledge, has actually ratified the Maternity Protection Convention 183. In terms of the Convention 156 on workers with family responsibilities, only Belize has ratified. So there is still some work there in terms of, yes, there are things, but what exactly and how are they being implemented? My third comment, and this goes again with that, I love that how it came to the forefront, the care, right? The availability of public care. And in the Caribbean, we see that public care is just not there. And there's still this very common practice that is called, or that we refer to as child shifting, right? Where actually women, they actually leave their children within their network, within their families, and very often with female members of their network. And so that in a way helps them enter the labor market or be active, but at the same time, they have another female who can't, because they are they're taking care of their kids. And in a way, it's really because there's just not affordable childcare at times and places that are convenient. So I think in that area, absolutely, there's a lot to be done, both from the government perspective and from the employer's perspective. My fourth comment is actually on the reform process as a process. And I think here, Susana and the paper, they do a great job in identifying what reforms there could be, but where there's also a problem is actually in how we get to that process of reforms, and how to identify and we talk about what reforms are needed. And just in an anecdote, I was, in my time there, I was talking with a country in the Caribbean around business environment reform, but there were no women from the side of the government there to discuss. And so when it came to measures, for example, there were very interesting discussions around maternity protection. There were no women. And so while having women join, and the interesting thing, which was mentioned also in the report, is that on the other hand, the Caribbean, in terms of the private sector, and in our studies found it, is that at the managerial level, women are everywhere, and the Caribbean is often highlighted as an example, right? But then in the public sector, it's still not there, and women are lagging. And so by having these women, it doesn't immediately solve the problem, but I do think that by having it could help us avoid those blind spots when we're trying to identify what reforms should be prioritized. Fifth, and my last comment before I leave it to others, and I think I'm sure it's something that Susana and her team have struggled with, and it's a message that from the ILO Caribbean office we've often made the case for, and it's that in the region there's very little data available. And it's often, for example, we see, and if you look back and you look at the tables that there's very little from the Caribbean in all the report, and it's because there is very little data. There is, for example, no use of time use surveys. That kind of information would really help us in the Caribbean to understand what is it really that is making women not take full participation in the labor market. And so my message there again, and our message as an office often is trying to make that case of how the Caribbean, the return on investment in investing in these, in getting that information, in getting that data, in getting that sex disaggregated data. But it's also sometimes very difficult knowing when you're working in a region where debt is so high and governments have other priorities, right? But there needs to be that real important message of how important it is to get that information. For now, I'm just going to stop there. I'd love to talk more about the male-dominated sectors.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the contribution. We'll certainly be coming back. There's a few questions in the chat I can see already. We'll be directing to you shortly, but thank you for your initial insights and remarks. It's greatly appreciated. I guess sticking with data, perhaps Rich will come to you next with regards to hearing more about the perspective across the African continent from a research point of view. What are your thoughts on the topic, Rich?
Well, thank you very much, Karl, and want to also join the others to thank the authors. I think they've done a good job to look at an area that has been very, very critical in the work on economic policy across Africa for quite a long time. I've been privileged to be part of the African Center for Economic Development and Planning, where we have been training economic policymakers across Africa. It's based in Dakar on gender and economics. And one of the reasons we went into that kind of discussion was really to try and get to some of the questions that are being highlighted in this paper and in this publication. Because I would like to therefore just add about 3 or 4 points to reflect further instead of coming back to the key issues that have been well articulated. I think first for me is to challenge ourselves. I think one of the things that we have to do as development practitioners is when we get into this discussion on how to reform the environment that will bring equal opportunities for women, we have to go back to some of the foundational philosophies that create this environment. One of the things which is clear is that even from the statistics that you showed, that this disparity in terms of time allocation for women and men clearly shows that there is something that we must do in terms of our economics, which will mean that we have to probably count differently. That one of the things that has to happen is that if we are going to actually create meaningful reform, we have to do a reform at the level of how we do our social accounting. Because if we actually care to count the care economy in its totality and in its full contribution to an economy, the overall economy, I think that will be a good starting point to give us a sense that women's contribution is actually much higher than what we are actually counting. Because the challenge now, which is there in the traditional economics that we are dealing with, is that we are making the argument as if women have to work a little bit harder to get into the economy. So for example, when you say, or when we have this idea of saying there is something called male-dominated sectors, and therefore we want more women in the male-dominated sectors. But one would ask the question that when you have more, is the domination only about numbers? And somebody will say, no, the domination is also about power. It's about how women and men have differentials in economic power, in economic agency, in economic decision making, and in social decision making. And that is what creates this domination. So in a sense, we have to be really thinking about how to push those boundaries beyond numbers, that yes, we must have the numbers of women there, the 50-50, but also we must have some strategies that go back further, to go beyond just the numbers, to think about what is the actual infrastructure that is supporting these industries. If we talk about law, for example, the fact that we want to have a reform at the level of the law, But if these laws are inherently patriarchal, in the sense that they are coming from an ideology that wants to privilege, that wants to keep male privilege, then we are going to have a challenge even when we reform those laws. So we have to even look further and say, what are the things, for example, even the people who are framing the laws that they need to understand? What should the judges be able to understand? How sensitive to gender should they be if they are going to look at some of these issues? So yes, the paper has done a lot. When I read, I was looking at articulating the barriers, the legal barriers, the regulations, the issues around social and cultural norms and other things. But clearly, and I think as the former speaker just said, the issue around care and is really going to be very critical, because I think that what we have done in economics for a long time is to allow for economies to thrive out of unpaid care. That at a household level, women are the producers, the reproducers, they look after us as economic agents, we become good, we get into the market, we do all these things, but there isn't an actual connection and counting of that care. And I think for me, a fundamental shift that we must make, it will be the shift of how we count care across Africa, across different places. We have been training several policymakers, and this is a debate that we've had with them, including the macroeconomists, to say that we must look at the fundamental assumptions of these macroeconomic models that we use when we are looking at our GDP, when we are looking at our all the different counting that we do, so that we can go further down. Another important, I think, issue that, for example, I thought would also be amplified in this paper, although touched on, is this whole question of asset acquisition. I think when you think about the impact acquisition and ability to acquire assets can do in terms of economic empowerment, it's huge. And I think that a recommendation in that area would also add quite a bit of value. But I think those are some of the issues that came to mind when I read this paper, and I thought it's a very good paper in terms of expanding our understanding and the policy issues that we need to tackle. Thank you for listening.
Richard, thank you so much for your wisdom, reflections, and contributions. So last but by no means least, Sally, interested to hear your take on things, I guess in practice, on the ground, from the Kenyan Association of Manufacturers. What's your perspective on how we promote more labour opportunities for women?
Thank you, Karl, and the ICR team for inviting Kenya Association of Manufacturers on this platform. I think just to comment and picking up on what some of my fellow panelists have been talking about, I will specifically talk about the manufacturing sector because Dr. Susana actually mentioned it in her report, and the focus that we need to put in terms of increasing women's participation in non-traditional sectors such as manufacturing. When you look at the manufacturing sector in Kenya, it's actually the largest revenue earner for government and the second largest in terms of GDP contribution to the country. However, the sector has been losing in terms of its competitiveness, and it's been losing primarily because the other half of the population is more or less on the bench. So I do agree with the findings that there's actually relatively low numbers in terms of having women in non-traditional sectors. When we looked at some of our own data, Kenya Association of Manufacturers actually did the first ever Women in Manufacturing report in Kenya and in East Africa. And when we looked at our own numbers internally, in the year 2018, for example, the formal employment percentages in manufacturing for men was 84%, but for women was 16%. In 2019, the percentage for women increased by only 1% to 17%, and we're still waiting to do a very comprehensive report on what 2020 shows. But given the impact of, again, the COVID-19 pandemic, it is sure to show that some of those numbers have reduced. And what we normally say in the sector is that we do advocate for the increase of the participation of women in the manufacturing sector, but it's all well and good for people to say, oh yes, we've included women in the sector, but then leave them at the factory floor or, you know, in the peripheries where they're not able to harness a lot of the productivity or profitability of being within the manufacturing sector itself. So even when you look at the movement of women from, for example, the factory floor to managerial plant manager level, for example, there's such a huge disparity, such a huge link that is missing, and the movement is quite sluggish and slow because you'll still find that a lot of men dominate managerial positions in plants and factories, and then women actually do the factory floor work for years. You could find women doing that for more than 5 years. Yet there should actually be a program that is that government and other stakeholders probably come up with to find out if these women don't have formal education to move them up the chain, can they certify and can they quantify and qualify this work that they've been doing on the factory floor for 5 years into something that these women can use to go up the chain and you know, get their promotions and get better positions and better paid work. I think I'd also comment on the fact that we have an existing legal framework with some of the issues that look at women's participation. When we looked at the policy and legislative frameworks in Kenya, most of them are gender blind. We have only 2 that are gender transformative. So the Constitution of Kenya, that was in 2010, and that's the second one is the Micro, Small and SMEs Act of 2012. But the rest of them, which are equally important and very critical for women, especially women in non-traditional sectors like the Employment and Labor Relations Act, the Labor Institutions Act, Occupational Safety and Health Act, all of those are actually gender blind. And for the ones that are considered, so to speak, gender transformative, what we are seeing is that it has not translated into equitable participation for women in manufacturing, especially because the implementation, the compliance, and the enforcement is lacking. So I think that's one thing that I'd like to corroborate from some of Dr. Susana's findings. The other thing is the cultural norms. So Women in Manufacturing program has actually been, since this year, going into the sub-national level. We've been engaging previously on a national level, but we went into the counties in Kenya this time and just really looked at how different cultures impede or assist women to get into non-traditional sectors. And what we're finding is that as long as we continue to look at cultural issues, just as the first panelist said, we look at cultural issues as separate issues from economic issues. But what we're finding is that a lot of women lack agency. So you have women whose job is primarily to be mothers and to be wives, and they cannot imagine spaces outside of that. So for us to go as an association and talk about economic empowerment would be a very disjointed kind of conversation. So we would need to come at it from a very basic and fundamental point of view in order for them to see themselves first and foremost as human beings who contribute to the economic development of the country, and then progress the conversation from there. And then the cultural norms will also permeate educational institutions. So you find the gatekeepers at educational institutions, technical vocational training institutions, being the ones that actually propagate this without thinking, obviously, that they're doing anything wrong. So we have a shortage of welders, and especially female welders in the manufacturing sector. And if a woman or a girl who's coming out of high school goes into a technical institution and says, hey, I'm interested in doing welding, the gatekeepers from many cultural areas would ask her if she's not sure she wants to do something else, like salon or weaving or, just gender segregated, careers. So we found that this is actually something that could use more work and more support. And social cultural contexts do influence policy formulation and the ability of women to take up roles in the workplace outside of what they have been assigned. And then I think lastly, I will also say that we also noticed that for women, a lot of women who actually want to join the manufacturing sector suffer from a crisis of confidence. And the crisis of confidence obviously is tied a lot more to the fact that they've been told what to do, but also, or what not to do, but also the fact that even institutions that are supposed to be very established do have policies on paper that should support the participation and the onboarding of women into these sectors. However, the execution is lacking, and the personnel who are supposed to execute are not very well equipped. They're underfunded and their capacity is low. So I think those are some of the comments that I would make from our perspective. We also looked at some of the support that government gives to women in terms of whether it is policies or funding. And most of the women don't even know that government gives this support. So there is just a disjointed way in which it works, that government thinks, oh, we are supporting, or the labor office thinks that they're supporting in one way or another. But women out there in the labor market don't know that there is this support for them that exists. So I think those gaps are really glaring. For the business environment, for the private sector, what we're trying to do, because primarily we still face a lot of discrimination for younger women who want to come into small and medium businesses. And we have a lot of stakeholders saying that these women are expensive, so they might come in and have children, and we don't want that. We cannot sustain that. So as the business associations, we are now having critical conversations with government on how we can remove this stigma and this stereotyping and this discrimination for younger women wanting to come to work in the sector, by compensating also the businesses that think that this is an expensive venture, because at the end of the day, small and medium businesses are quite overtaxed and overregulated in this country. So what we're trying to see is, if we do reduce, or if we do work on incentives, in the short term, of course, that is not a very long-term solution, but if we do work on incentives in which the businesses can feel, if I do take in this number of young women who are interested in welding and machine operation, then the government is able to subsidize me in taxes A, B, and levies A, B, and C. So that is the kind of conversation that we are having. And it has started because we are having the Women in Manufacturing program primarily because I wouldn't say manufacturing issues are very specific. They're not the same issues as service sector issues, for example. So I would agree completely with the report, and I'm really thankful that I've had a chance to look at it. And just comparatively to our environment and what we're experiencing, I think great work to Dr. Susana and the team that worked on the report. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sally, for all of your contributions and again, and insights, giving us some further unpacking of the cultural and socio norms and barriers that are certainly in place. So thanks again. At this point, I'm going to invite all of the speakers and panelists to put your cameras back on, actually. We'll bring you back up, bring you all out for us to move the section of the event on to some questions and answers. We've got some questions coming in, and by all means, if you're tuning in from wherever you are in the world, please do send us in some questions. We've got a bit of time before we wrap up to try and address as many as we can. So here it goes. I'm going to throw the first question out, which is with regards to, thank you, Edwin in Ghana, who's asking about which non-traditional jobs and sectors tend to create more jobs and better income for women. He's asking particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, but I think perhaps more broadly. Susana, maybe from your initial research, you want to kick that off?
Yes, sure. I was also responding online that question. We don't have specific information about Ghana. access to information is so difficult, as Virginia was also saying. We know with many studies, McKinsey have been writing a lot about that, the Web Economic Forum. Some studies are about large countries in Africa. Nigeria and South Africa are in Sub-Saharan Africa, the one that used to have more information. But what we know overall, this might not be true in each country, but overall is that technology type of jobs are increasing. And I'm not talking only about developers. Of course, there's an increased amount of developers, but also call centers, for example. Think about all the ways we change behaviors during the pandemic, and then more people are calling to a restaurant to get their food. So call centers are booming, and we need, for example, to train more people in call centers. They can do it from their homes, so it's safer. They tend to be formal jobs. Of course, developers, design, a lot of these jobs that are related to being more in the technology. For example, a lot of admin assistants are disappearing. This was a trend already before the pandemic, and we know this from the World Economic Forum report in 2017 that it was saying like 4 out of 5 jobs that are going to be destroyed in the next 10 years are going to be female. So admin assistants are disappearing, which tend to be mostly women. And this is also because all these in productivity technologies, AI, are making our lives easier when we work online. This is true, and this is a debate that we had a lot internally. This might only refer to 10% of the African labor market, but it's still worrisome. So other jobs that might relate to a great extent of the sub-Saharan Africa labor force could also relate to, for example, booming in construction, and we know that construction is way male dominated, and we have to do an effort to train women. So that's an area where it's exploring in infrastructure and in-house construction. Manufacturing also, and manufacturing of particular products is also expanding. So yeah, I can share with you guys a list that the World Economic Forum also published recently, 2018, upgrading the information with the pandemic. But we see these creation when everybody says like, oh, the pandemic is destroying all these jobs. We see a destruction and a creation. So that's very important. The destruction in some areas that, for example, restaurants, tourism, which is key in the Caribbean economies, were really hardly hit, and these are areas where women tend to be very present. And also we need to understand the value chain of all those industries. That's really important, because it's not only the hotels, it can be all the little restaurants and all the little businesses, formal, informal, that benefit from that whole economy of tourism. So yeah, those are some examples. I can share. I'm gonna share the link.
That's really kind. That's a fairly comprehensive response. So thank you so much for that. I guess there's one question that's come up next, which relates to one of the things you were just talking about. And perhaps, Richard, I might come to yourself around to see how, from your research perspective, says how the digital era, thank you, Stefano, is asking how the digital era can help reduce the gender gaps. I know Susana was just alluding to a little bit, but what's your perspective on the technology?
Technology. Sorry, I thought it was for me, but yeah, Rich, go.
Sorry, we'll go to Richard next. Yeah, here's some insights, perhaps. Thanks, Richard.
Okay, sorry. No, I think the point that has been made already by Susana is probably the one I'll repeat and expand on, which is that technology has really created this opportunity. I mean, even in places like here in Uganda, where I'm based, we are seeing quite an expansion of businesses, for example, during the lockdown, that migrated very quickly onto Facebook or onto other social media like Instagram. And, some of the people who moved on to those platforms are realizing that they are cutting overhead costs significantly. They are able to reach much larger markets than they used to do when they sat in a small shop somewhere. So I think there is that as an opportunity. And of course, the fact that some of this technology allows people from working from home, that means that it can be combined, Not that that is the best solution, but it can be combined with some care work that can't get stopped because of any of the things that we are doing. So I guess there is an opportunity there, and the good thing is that I think the world there is a lot more people playing a part in the digital value chain. You are seeing many young people providing all kinds of tools that are assistive in terms of making businesses much more efficient. So yeah, for me, that's what I see. And probably what I should add is that there isn't one specific area where you can say that this will be the best. I think what we are seeing in the whole digital value chain at different nodes, you are seeing women getting opportunities, more opportunities as we go along. Yeah, that's what I would add.
Thank you for sharing. I'm kind of curious actually to bounce the similar question to Sally as well, in terms of from a manufacturing kind of traditional industrial perspective. What's your take on the advancements of technology? Is that hindering? Is that creating opportunities? What's your perspective?
I think it creates a lot of opportunities for women because, as Richard has said, it does go over previous barriers that existed. So once we onboarded, for example, a lot of women who locally manufacture products onto Jumia, which is our online sort of marketplace here, and give them a special made in Kenya brand, you'd find that a lot of them were able to access markets across the country that would previously they were not able to. Because what is happening in terms of devolution in Kenya is if I move my goods across 3 counties, I have to pay multiple levies, fees, and charges across all 3 counties. Whereas if I'm doing my business on Jumia online, if I do get orders, I'll just pay the rider or the delivery truck, and it doesn't have first and foremost your company logo, so it doesn't have to pay all those multiple levies, fees, and charges that you're subjected to as a company. So I think it creates that. The only thing is that there is still a gap in terms of access to knowing how to navigate different platforms, technological platforms. And a lot of women definitely have phones, and a lot of women do use, M-Pesa or, to do money transactions or whatever, but there's that lack of knowledge on how else to optimize their digital tools in order to then get out there and have their brand seen. So there's a lack of knowledge and there's a gap that exists, but I believe that women are actually quite well positioned to take advantage of digital workplaces and opportunities that are arising. Thank you.
That's good to hear. It's good that the new technology can also give a boost to traditional industries as well, that they can work collaboratively and not always competitively. So thanks for that. Virginia, got a question, I think, coming to yourself probably next. There's a comment from Jana, who's interested in understanding a bit more about some of these reforms. I guess, Susana, perhaps we'll double back to you in a moment as well. But maybe, Virginia, initially, what other examples, other than simplifying tax systems, what other examples of kind of reforms or fiscal reforms or business environment reforms have you come across from a kind of ILO perspective?
So, Karl, I would love to answer that question, but I haven't really come across, as Susana was saying. I mean, it's something that is quite relatively new, right? So, from where I've been, but I'll definitely try and look and find some answers to that. If you allow me, I just wanted to kind of maybe just say a few things on the last question around technology. And I think here we're talking about 2 very different things. We're talking about, on the one hand, the use of technology, and then women leading in technology. And I think there, as Sally was very rightly saying, there are great opportunities in having women, carry out their businesses or access information through technology. The issue always there is not only access to information on how to use it, but even access to the devices, even to the connectivity, especially if we're talking about rural women. And so in those aspects, it's a huge opportunity. At the same time, if we don't make the environment, we don't create the system for them to be an opportunity, we're going to again see greater divides between women and men and use through technology. And then there's the other area of women in technology. And I think there, absolutely, I think there needs to be a lot more investment in women in STEM. And we're seeing that across the board, how we're investing more and more. I think it's also super important. I'm always a huge fan of role models, of, you know, you become what you're able to see. And so as we see more women in these sectors, then we hope that more women will go in, and they won't be thinking, oh, actually that's something for my brother to do. So just wanted to kind of just say a few things there in terms of, you know, use technology as a means and technology as a sector for you to develop. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing. Susana, I know that you've got a response, so we'll come to you next. Yeah, what are your other things would you recommend?
Yeah, I also want to add something to the previous question, but very short, and then I go to the next one. I think that we also need to think that when we think about technology, we think only about high tech and developers. There's a lot of jobs in the formal sector that low income people with a high school degree and even less can do. So for example, I was saying that the call centers, they need to learn a software that takes 3 months to train. We're seeing a lot of programs in Latin America for women, where in 6 months, people with high skill degrees can become web page coders, and their income is really, really good, like 3-4 times the average national income. So there are other, we don't think about, you know, we don't need to think about being engineers. I think that we need to think about the short-term strategy, medium-term strategy, and a long-term strategy. So yes, doing all these efforts for girls in STEM, that's a long-term strategy. We need to do it. But right now, the governments and companies and business associations can do a lot with short courses to train and retrain women and men, of course, but with a focus on women on these other jobs that don't need 5 years to, and a lot of aspirations to be done. So I think that's something really important. And the other thing with regards to taxes, well, I recommend to read the chapter, but some examples. So we know that the joint tax system affects women because when female and male that are married report their taxes together, the second earner, which is usually the female, is taxed more. So then it comes if you have 3 kids and you're super busy and like, oh, why should I do that? Maybe she will keep working, but maybe she would choose to do something in the informal sector so that she's not taxed. And then we're gonna miss more improvements in productivity, and the government is gonna lose taxes. So that's one example. Another example that is in Ghana actually, and in South Africa, we talk about this one in the report, is that women tend to pay more taxes and not to have deductions. Meaning, for example, let's say in a country you pay taxes when you make more than, I'm gonna say whatever number, $1,000 per month, then you pay taxes. But you can only get, you only have to report deductions when you make 1,500,000. So because women tend to be in the lowest income bracket, they can be penalized by paying more taxes because they have lower income. And these happen in Ghana and in South Africa, and we explain there. Another that we don't go in a lot of detail there because it's not directly related to the labor market, but it's really important, is the TVA, because when you tax basic goods, you're affecting more women. Basic goods can be food, can be also like female products are more heavily taxed in some countries. They call it the pink tax. So that tax also, that direct, the indirect tax, meaning the tax of the products we consume when they are at the same level or even lower in certain basic products, they tend to affect women's available income, not necessarily women's employment, but available income. So we go into some details there, and there's also a lot of really interesting references because, of course, we were very limited in the amount of examples that we could give. And very important, Virginia said, there's not much information about this. So we need to keep studying what's going on with these tax systems in Africa and in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Caribbean, and in Pacific Islands.
Thanks so much, and keep sharing the good practice. I appreciate looking at the clock. We're coming to the end of our session. So before I thank you all for your contribution, I'm curious to see whether we could do a final whip round of the 60-second, 1-minute contribution from each of you. I'm really keen to see whether we could try it out. To think about any tactics that you could recommend in advocating for more equal opportunity for women with regards to policymakers. How do you incentivize or influence policymakers to be promoting reforms for more equal opportunities for women? As a final thought, any kind of key takeaway, key message for those tuning in today and advocating? So we'll go around each of you, if that's okay. I'll give you a moment to compose a response, but perhaps Sally, could I come to you first, put you on the spot?
Yeah, sure. Just a couple of thoughts in terms of policy recommendations or policy actions. Number one, I think that business associations and the business community is very key in terms of advising and assisting and holding to account policymakers in terms of making sure that existing policies actually work for women. And then there is need, especially in many countries, and mine in particular, to consolidate legal, regulatory, and compliance requirements into a single place to enhance efficiency and reduce the cost of doing business for a lot of women, because that's what takes a lot, that's what makes a lot of women disadvantaged in this area. And the other thing, as Virginia said, is increased STEM awareness or STEAM awareness campaigns in rural and urban settings, and advocate with the Ministry of Education and other stakeholders to provide action spaces for women in STEM courses, because what we see is the funnel between secondary school, TVET institutions and the factories, the numbers continue to dwindle as you go along, so there needs to be that. And then the other thing, the final thing, is to lobby for targeted incentives for women, whether it's recognition incentives for these women that I mentioned happen to be at the factory floor, or picking tea or picking coffee. What are the incentives, or how can we begin to recognize and appreciate their work and actually give remuneration that will see them go up the ladder and ascend, and also just, being able to give the same incentives for women-led and women-owned manufacturing companies, so that they can then practice increasing the participation of more women into the industry. Thank you.
Thank you, Sally. Thank you so much. Virginia, I'm going to come to you next. A final thought. What would be your key thing for influencing policymakers?
So I will definitely not be as articulate as Sally. I'll try and, I think in the ILO context and how things happen, I think competition between countries is healthy. And what we see, for example, at the International Labour Conference is countries, when suddenly they realize that they haven't ratified a convention, but others have, and actually countries in the same region. And suddenly there's that heated thing of, oh, I need to do this as well. And so in that sense, I think having countries from the same region, I think in the Caribbean, often we compare them to other countries, other regions that it doesn't speak to them. So actually kind of having those countries kind of discuss and say, well, I've done this, and and you should do that. I think that's always, competition is always good. Long term, I know, but data, facts, numbers, that can speak to policymakers. We need to really work on that. And my last thing, again, my message around let's get the women at the table. I think in that sense, for the Caribbean, that would be super, super helpful. That's it.
Definitely agreed. Absolutely. And thanks so much again. Last couple of minutes. Rich, you got a brief final thought for us?
Well, a quick final thought for me is probably to pick up from what Virginia has said, is that I think to demonstrate the benefits that women's economic participation, women's business opportunity is not a loss, but a gain for the economy, for the country. I think this has to sink in deeply in every policymaker's mind, that when we do what we have to do, when we create opportunity, when we integrate care in our economic thinking, we are not losing, but we are benefiting. That, I think, is still a message that not everybody has understood, but which I think is critical for all of us if we are to see what we are advocating for take root. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for your contribution, for your time, for your remarks today. It's greatly appreciated. Again, we'd encourage you all to read the report, which is online, and we look forward to your responses. As we're running, so thanks again to all the panelists and speakers today. For our final closing remarks, I'm going to be inviting Escipión, Assistant Secretary General from the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States. Welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Karl. Sorry that I couldn't join since the beginning, but I have followed a little, and I have been really impressed by the level of discussions. For those that do not know us, the OACPS is the Organization of African, Caribbean and Pacific States. We were created in 1979 through the Georgetown Agreement, and nowadays we have the privilege of regrouping countries all around the globe, working towards a common goal. That common goal is promoting sustainable development and a fairer economy. So the question debated here today about promoting equal opportunities for women is very important. It's at the center of development. Woman empowerment is very necessary, and sometimes men like myself do not realize the hurdles that women have to do business. So we're very happy to have this discussion to try to promote a public-private sector dialogue to enhance the role of all vulnerable people in the societies. When we're talking about today about women, but also we're trying to promote youth and other ones. So we're very happy to the collaboration that we have with the ICR facility and with its partners from the British Council, from the German Cooperation Ministry, GIZ, expert in France and CNV. And we look forward really to engage discussions with all of you on how we can really promote a fairer society, a society with all members of the society can live and prosper. And through this work, we hope to promote more peaceful and prosperous society. So thanks a lot for being here with us today. We'll be reading all your comments, and any comments that you might have in the report are also very interesting. So we're very proud to be able to be associated with this exercise. And from my Secretary General, Mr. Chicote, I would like to thank everybody for being here. And Karl, again, thanks for a wonderful way that you have conducted the meeting.
My pleasure. Thanks again for all your support and collaboration. This wouldn't be possible without you. So, so thanks again for the closing remarks. We're coming to the end of the session. There is a poll. We'd love to get your feedback and upon the satisfaction of the webinar. It's also worth mentioning that you can find more information about the ICR facility on the website and how we can support public and private dialogue in any of the African, Caribbean and Pacific countries to make a more conducive, sustainable, inclusive business environment and investment climate for now and for the future. So do reach out, do get in touch. Let us know how we can support you and the development of the business environment reforms where you're based. And also, just to mention, this was the second of in the series of women empowerment events. We'll have another webinar in November, so watch this space. We'll share some links, and we look forward to you joining us next time as we continue our commitment to women's economic empowerment. But for today, I just have the privilege of saying thanks for listening and for watching. Do check out the links. Do let us offer us your feedback. And until next time, to be continued. Thanks very much.